Hello and welcome. It's a Dr. Pepper Wednesday. Cheers. Um, I was able to find some Dr. Pepper at one of my local shops. Bought a whole case, 24 cans. 58 yen a can, I believe. All right, let's get into our topic today. It's inspired by two recent articles, very recent, in fact. I was going to make this vlog last night, and it's interesting that if I had, I wouldn't have seen today's newspaper. And in today's newspaper, we have another story that's very much in line with what I'm about to talk about: English education in Japan. And this video is not going to tend to be a little bit more negative, but it's it's not peaches and cream. It's not the everything's wonderful that you might want to hear about. So I feel like I'm going to have to make a follow-up video to today's vlog and talk to you, and I feel like I can do this now, and I haven't done it yet, but talk to you about my perspective on my 5 years as an ALT, as a JET participant, what I felt like I brought to my little part of Japan. You know, did I really teach anyone any English? Did I do this nebulous thing called internationalization? Was I successful? Was it worth my time? Was it worth Japan's money to pay me to come and live and work in Japan for the 5 years that I spent in a very, very rural part of Shimane Prefecture? So I'm going to do that, I think, in a different vlog, and I will talk about, what I feel like I was able to accomplish, and what are some of the things that are very tangible achievements and, good things that came of me being in Japan. Because as you know, I mean, I'm a big supporter for the program, and I feel like, if you don't treat it as kind of your 5th year of college, as just a travel party, then you can give a lot and get a lot from being a JET. And but your job, and it is a job, is to teach, and to teach English. And so the articles here. The first article was yesterday, and it was by this guy named Mike Guest, and I've been reading him for about 6 years now. English may not be the right choice for everyone, and Mike's a bit of a curmudgeon. Is that the right word? How do you say that word? He's a little cranky sometimes. But I think he's seen and heard it all in the field of English education in Japan, and he kind of just goes right to the brunt of the topic here. And he's a professor of English at Miyazaki University, and he writes this column about once a month for the Yomiuri. But before I get to his comments, which are interesting, and I'm going to go through them and talk to you and tell you whether I agree with him or what my perspective is on it. This is Helene Uchida, who I've talked about before, who I don't necessarily agree with very often, but she also writes a column, and she is the director of a Fukuoka-based company called Little America. And she's basically an Eikaiwa teacher that also trains other Eikaiwa teachers, Eikaiwa being English language school. And so her column appeared today on Wednesday, January 30th, and it's talking about English in Japan, but on a, when should it start, and what should its goal be at the primary school level is really her focus. But she makes some good points here. I will compliment her and say she makes some good points that as an English teacher now for over 7 years, I've started to notice myself. And they're good things to keep in mind when you're thinking about becoming a JET, doing JET, becoming an ALT for Interact or any of the other companies, or just coming over to teach at a language school. What is the value of English in Japan, and how did we get here, in 2013? So basically, she in her article she sets the stage. English is everywhere, right? You come to Japan, you will be surprised. There's English on the T-shirts. There's English on signs. There's where you wouldn't even expect there to be English. I was driving along the other day, and on the little roadside signs of these plastic things they put around these metal bars to make barriers, it just said nothing in Japanese. It just said the word sorry. in English. And it's like, who is that for? Why is that there? Um, J-pop is replete with, English chorus and English shout-outs. I mean, it's just like the K-pop song, hey, sexy lady, Um, so, those kind of things in J-pop, you hear it all the time. You go to restaurants, you'll have menus in English, a lot of katakana English too. Anyway, in advertising, there's tons of English. So you would think that maybe people use English to communicate here in Japan, but the truth is they don't. And it's tough, even if I find something wrong, I'll often ask a child, or now with daigakse, with college students, I'll be like, do you know what your shirt says? Do you know what the English is? Or on their folder or on their bag or whatever, it'll just have English all over it. Do you understand what it means? And sometimes I'll tell them, and they just kind of like, yeah, they don't really care. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong English, because it's just decorative. It really is. It's not a means of actually, conveying meaning. It's just there because it looks cool. It's cool. Um, so she was saying that, they decided, okay, well, we need to get better at English. How are we going to do this? This is, the Japanese ministry is in charge of English education. And so they decided that, first of all, in 1998, about 6 years before I came over as an ALT, but definitely right in the middle of when JET was happening, they did this thing called the Period for Integrated Studies at primary schools, and this is what was in place when I arrived. So you've got to imagine, okay, an elementary school in Japan. The teachers, the homeroom teachers, obviously, just like your elementary school, probably from where you were, teach all, say, 6 subjects. They teach math, they teach history, they teach reading, they teach the kids how to write kanji, they teach science. They're probably their PE teacher too, all these things, right? And so they basically said, okay, well, we're going to set up this period where you can talk about information technology, environmental studies, social welfare, and health, and if you want, foreign language. So it was a way for them to say, hey, we're offering them time to talk about English, to teach English, but they didn't have to. And some of them, it was clearly not a top priority. Then, in about 2006, they took a survey, and most schools had started to use this time in some way for English. And a lot of that was ALT people like me. They would bring us in, and we would do our monkey dance, and, sometimes it was great. Sometimes you'd have a teacher standing right next to you translating everything I would say into Japanese. It's like, what's the point? Sometimes we were there to entertain. Sometimes we were there to actually try to get them to learn something. So this is what happened. Then in 2011, after I left, but the pilot program of it started the year I was leaving in 2009. They have this kind of textbook, and 5th and 6th graders are meant to study English. I believe it's still only like 1 hour a week. So there is some move to get 5th and 6th graders started on the path to English, and that's where Japan is now in 2013. Okay, and then of course they study it for 3 years in junior high school, and then most high schools also make them study in some way or another at least 2 of the 3 years they're in high school. If it's an academic school where they really are gunning to go to university, it's all 3 years, and it's not a lot of talking with the ALT. It's more grammar translation type of work in high school. So they said, okay, well, what can be done? So this guy named Mr. Ito, former president of the Japan Association of English Teaching in Primary Schools, he said that Japan needs 4 things for successful English education: good teachers, good students, good methods, good materials. Well, okay, sure. But how do you get there? So basically, this lady that wrote the article is saying that a big problem is the teachers, the homeroom teachers, these teachers that are brought in to teach elementary school, and they have to teach, all the subjects, but they just haven't been given enough training in English or to have any confidence, to have any expertise. They're not English teachers who are also going to teach science and math, and because it's not their native language. I mean, it'd be like me if I were an American teacher in junior high school and I was teaching history, which is what I majored in university, and they all of a sudden said, okay, Jason, and now, starting, next semester, you're going to teach Spanish once a week. And I'd be like, what? I didn't study Spanish ever, oh, well, we'll give you some training. We'll give you 6 weeks of training. And, and I'd be like, what? Now, of course, in America, I'd have enough Spanish students probably in my class that they could teach me. But obviously, there's no native speakers in the class to assist the teachers here. And so, what's the solution there? So the lady that wrote this, Miss Uchida, says that, whenever you survey other countries that are doing well in English, especially, say, in Europe, they always start earlier. They start first grade, second grade, third grade at the latest. So she's saying we got to start earlier, that classes have to be taught by teachers who have a good command of the language, and they need to be at least 3 times a week. So like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or, however it works out. And she says it must be geared toward communicative English. English for speaking, not not learning how to write the alphabet. I mean, that will come, but about speaking and communicating. So at a lot of universities, see, if you want to become an elementary school teacher, I don't know exactly, and somebody, if you know, please leave a comment. But basically, I'm assuming, you have to take classes in child psychology, and, you have to pass this math test and that science test, excuse me, to show that you have the basic skills, right, to teach all these different subjects, just like in America. And my guess is you probably have to get a minimum score in English on something like the TOEIC test or the TOEFL test, which are famous tests in Japan that students and adults take to show their English proficiency. But, they don't really translate necessarily to real-world speaking and certainly to teaching. So she's saying that they need to have a 4-year English training program that kind of goes along with their training in how to be an elementary school teacher. They also should be training on how to teach English for their entire, 4 years there in college, training to be an elementary school teacher, with perhaps a 6 months internship abroad, or, a study abroad or something where they go to Australia, South Africa, America, Canada, somewhere where English is a native language. I think that's a good idea. That's up to colleges, I guess, to figure that out. Certainly the teachers that are better at English, that feel like they're better at English, I think probably don't apply to be... Well, I mean, your whole motivation for teaching elementary versus junior high or high school is really different. Even for me, if I went back to America, would I want to teach 5th grade? Would I want to teach 8th grade? Would I want to teach, 12th grade? So there's all kinds of factors that go into that. But if the teachers who are better at English can get the junior high and high school teaching jobs in English, and I believe it's better pay and yada yada. So, maybe that's kind of a little bit of brain drain toward the upper echelon, and they don't get the best English teachers at the shogakko, the elementary level. All right. So she feels like, the children need to study more, and she wants, English to become communicative and not just decorative. And so she made some good points. Now Mike, on the other hand, just kind of like takes all of this and just throws it the fuck away. So it's already been 14 minutes, and I'm probably going to speak for another 10. But it's interesting what he has to say, and I don't know if I agree with it completely. And that's why I said I'm probably going to make this follow-up video and talk to you about how I feel like my time was well spent as an ALT in a jet. But some of what he has to say makes so much. If you've been here, especially to all of you that are now, right now, ALTs or were ALTs and are still watching my video, arigato. Um, it just makes a lot of sense. Okay, so he says one of the most common questions he gets, because he has this website, and I'll put the link down below. He's often asked about his position on English education policy in Japan, which, gets talked about a lot. How much funding should go toward it. Why are we lagging behind other countries? Why, when you walk up to an average Japanese person, can they barely speak English, even though they quote unquote studied it for 6 years? So anyway, how can we best solve the problem of English education in Japan is the most common question he gets. And he says, my question in return is there really a problem? What is it? So he says the thing he then hears back, the most common refrain is, most Japanese people can barely communicate in English at all, despite several years spent learning it. But I wonder, this is Mike speaking, why is that a problem? Who exactly is it a problem for? Why should the Japanese speak English? And I think some of you are already seeing where this is going, but it's an interesting question, and I think it is one that needs to be asked. And unfortunately, as educators, we can, say, I can look out at my class and go, does that kid really need English? Does that kid ever going to use English again, type of thing? But that's not my job. My job is to try to educate the people that are put in front of me. And the question is, why does Japan as a country feel like every citizen here needs to spend all that time studying English? Now, when I was in high school, most of you probably are like this. If you were an American and you were in high school, well, especially in California where I went, it was pretty standard that you knew that you needed 2 years of a foreign language to get into a good college. Like the UC system, UC Berkeley, UCLA, UCSD, which is where I went, to apply to go to Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, any of the big colleges. You needed to have studied Spanish. Back in the 80s, I went to high school. I graduated in 1987. I'm old. There was only a few choices. There was Spanish, French, German. And that was basically it. Some schools had Latin. Nobody had Chinese or Japanese yet back in the 80s. Now there's a plethora of choices of what the kids can study. And that's great. So you needed 2 years. So I studied French for 2 years. Why I didn't study Spanish, God only knows. I lived in Texas and California, but I studied French, and I didn't enjoy it. I kind of enjoyed it for about a year, and then my second year I hated it. It was a slog. And, I never went to Canada and used it. I never have been to France. It's completely, there's little tiny bits in my brain, and it's all gone, and I never really had to use it in any way in college because, I wasn't going to study French literature in college, or, I could have majored in European history and then I had to take in more French, but, anyway, I wanted to study Japanese when I went to college, so... Again, but the kids here in Japan aren't given this choice, I guess is what I'm getting down to. Some of them can choose to additionally study Portuguese or Chinese or Korean or something that would really actually be helpful, but they're made to take English. And even at my university, it's a small university, the freshmen and sophomores are made to take English. They have to take it. It's not an elective. So Mike is talking about this, and he says, a lot of people will tell him, well, Japan needs English. But to him, that's an empty slogan. Countries don't need languages, people do. And only some people at that. Japanese, and then he goes, into like who needs it. If you're working in an international field, you're working for a company that has offices abroad, you're working for, Toyota or Nintendo, where you could be sent to an office in an English-speaking country, etc., then sure. If you're a lawyer, a pilot, a doctor, where there's a lot of English jargon in your profession, whatever, then sure, study English. You need English. But a vast majority of Japanese people, might never leave Japan, will certainly never speak to anyone in English. and, on a daily basis, and just won't ever need it. So he thinks it's just another hoop to jump through, even if you sugarcoat it with buzzwords like internationalization. Most Japanese people don't need English, and they know this. All right, but the education ministry said several years ago that its goal is to cultivate Japanese who can use English for communication. So this is him. So Mike's response is, yeah, but it was an unrealistic, misguided goal. How can we expect the average Japanese who will almost never use English to maintain communicative skills in the language and be ready to retrieve it for productive communications on those rare occasions when it might be called for? When he's on this train platform and some lost gaijin needs help, when, he happens to be on the phone and the one client out of 100, speaks English in certain jobs. And so, and I kind of agree. It seems like we just throw a lot of things at the wall, as it were, and we hope a lot of it sticks. But, we got to ask why. So he says another complaint that you hear is Japan tends to rank very low in scoring internationally on standardized proficiency tests. It's true. He says that it's because we're now stuck between formal learning and this communication where we want the people to be able to speak better, but we still want them to be able to translate and write and read, and we haven't emphasized one or the other, and so they don't do as well at either. And he said a lot of test takers in Japan are hobbyists, and this is something you really only get to know if you come to Japan. But there's this whole swath of Japanese people that love to take tests just to get a certificate that says they took it. And I mean, it's in all kinds of fields. It can be in trains or flowers or, calligraphy or anything. And they have tests for kanji, like ancient kanji that you can take as a Japanese person. And so some of these people, study English as a hobby. And I mean, the adults who do that, fuel the eikaiwa industry. And they take these tests, so they're not really serious about it. It doesn't matter if they get a bad score. Oh, I'll try again next year. They're not trying to get a job or level up in their career advancement or anything. They're just doing it for quote unquote fun. And a lot of people are pushed into it too early before they're ready to take the test. We kind of want our students to keep going and ganbatte, and maybe they need more time. You hear Japan lament that it will fall behind China and Korea if we don't study English. But he makes a good point here that, that scientifically or, industrially, this is not true. I mean, if you went back 20 years in the heyday of Sony and the Walkman and Nintendo and everything else that was booming out of Japan, and you stopped the average Japanese person on the street and asked them to say something in English, their ability to speak English would be absolutely no different than the ability of a Korean person or a Chinese person. And I think the same would be true today. Even though China and Korea is seen as much better, if you went over the average Korean or Chinese person, I don't think speaks English probably that much better than your average Japanese person. But sometimes our perception is shaped by the fact that, when we travel and we go to these countries, and say we go to the Olympics in Beijing or something like, I go through Incheon Airport a lot when I fly from Osaka to Seoul, Korea, and then Korea to Los Angeles. And the Incheon Airport, I mean, everybody speaks English. There's all kinds of Western places to eat. There's bookstores with English books, and I'm kind of like, wow, Korean English. But obviously all these service workers are specifically picked because they can speak English. And if you go to just hotels and things like that, of course the wait staff, etc., is going to speak English. That is not your average person, especially not out where I live now or where I lived when I was an ALT in Shimane. And those people, just don't have that, recall command of English that that your perception might be colored by if you just travel and go to places, where they just had an Olympics or something. And of course, a lot of people will be able to speak English. All right. Let's get down to the last thing. So what does he suggest? Let's get down to the end here. He suggests a culling. I love that word. A streamlining of the system. People who want to study English can and should, but it should not be a national mandate. Okay? So obviously, if you're going to go into a field when you're in college that, English is advantageous, you're going to study English. But it doesn't need to be so monolithic where it's every citizen must know English. And he feels like you'll get better teachers, both Japanese and non-Japanese, because it will be more selective, and the people that are, the cream of the crop will rise to the top. How will this affect English taught in high schools? Well, he makes an interesting point here that he doesn't feel like the goal of your English education in high school should be to be able to go to a country and order off the menu or to make a hotel reservation. He feels that it should be more, cerebral, and, the way learning a language stimulates your brain, and being able to read something in a second language and get a different perspective on culture or life. So he feels like it should be more book learning, less communication. He's not worried about people, at least in high school, being able to speak English well. So, he's talking about how languages are good brain food. Learning how a language works, how it holds together, all this is part of a classical education, and this is why kids used to learn Latin and stuff a long time ago. So he says, obviously people are going to say, well, wait, that's a return to this boring old, rote grammar translation message, diagramming sentences. But he basically argues that, physics is physics, math is math, literature, A Tale of Two Cities hasn't changed in hundreds of years. A good teacher can make any of these subjects interesting in high school. Why can't, you teach a serious English class, but also have it be interesting? He's saying that, sure, it can be made to be boring, but it could also be made interesting and involving and worthwhile, and, emphasize speaking less. So, and I agree with that. So, why English? Wouldn't any other language do? And he'd say, yeah, if there's qualified teachers, the academic study of any language is fine. And, you got to think, I got to think, if you're a Japanese person, study Korean, study Chinese. This has got to be more helpful in a way. So, yeah. And I think a lot more high schools should offer those courses, and let the kids pick. I mean, if they want to choose English, let them choose English, but don't make it be English. Turn that 1 hour 3 times a week that they study English now and give them a choice. But that, of course, means that, you have to have qualified Chinese teachers and Korean teachers, which I don't know that we do, but, that could easily be remedied as well. So the big other thing is there's this huge exam in Japan called the center test. We just had it at my school. We host it, and high school students take it to get into college. It's kind of like the SAT, and on there is an English section that every student must take. And he thinks it's meaningless, that they have to take all this English from all these years of teaching and reduce it down to these machine readable ABC multiple choice type of questions for the kids to answer. And he said English should be part of the secondary tests they take, if they excel at a subject, or if they want to enter a college that, has an English program and they need to know what level their English is, then they take that section of the exam separately, but it should not be on the center test. And that way we wouldn't get, this kind of, just aiming at the middle, where, you can't have the kids that excel and you can't have the kids get too far behind. You got to just aim for the middle. So he says, okay, well, it would mean, his thing would mean fewer students study English, but with greater motivation and a clear sense of purpose. Everybody wins. And that was Mike's indirectly speaking column for today, yesterday, Tuesday, January 29th. So these are very interesting topics, very interesting takes on, English education in Japan. And, when you come over here, the biggest problem you can have sometimes is you want to apply, the way you went to school, the way you were taught, etc., to the Japanese method, and you can't do that. You can't say, look, I did it this way. This is clearly the best way. You should be doing it that way too. My local junior high school that I'm now the ALT at for 2 years, because I mean, A, that's arrogant, and B, you don't really know how good the results are. You haven't seen these kids go to high school. You don't know how they're doing outside of after you teach them, etc., etc. So. But a lot of Jets grumble and moan about the way English is taught in their schools, and there is something to that. But unfortunately, it can't be changed by Jet, and it's really got to come from the top down, and it's got to involve some real rethinking on, as Mike says, why does Japan need English? And some of you will say it absolutely needs English. We need to. English is the international language. English is the lingua franca of the world practically. But you look at a country like the Philippines. If you go to the Philippines, most people do speak English. I think it's basically the second language there. And but have they become this superpower because of their command of English? Has Singapore become this superpower? India is on the rise, and they certainly value English, but they had a history of it. They were occupied by England, for a long time. I don't necessarily think that Japan is going to change its future that much by this kind of draconian, everybody must learn English idea. And I really do wish that it could be more elective and more like an honors class, and you could weed some of the kids out. Okay, these kids need more help. These kids are really excelling. We could teach literature to the kids that can really read and really comprehend, and we could teach other things. And I'm sure there are some colleges I'm sure Mike's college, where he teaches, that do have super English programs and turn out some very high quality, people that can use English in their job and or teach English after they graduate. But it's just a very, very interesting question that I think Japan has to look at closely in the next few years. And the future of Jet is always in flux, etc., etc. But I will make that second video about why I think Jet is still a valuable thing and why I felt like I still made a contribution in my 5 years on the program. And you can see the kind of yin and yang of our existence here as foreigners in this great country. All right. Thanks for watching 33 minutes. Wow. But, I was wearing a tie. That counts for something, right? And I got a new Batman poster up there. So, something else new to look at. All right, guys. Peace. Thanks for listening to my jolly thoughts. And I'll see you next time. Bye.